Chapter 1, Cell Block D, number 28. The bus windows rattled, each vibration matching the tremor in Cassian Croft's hands. He pressed his forehead against the cool, grimy glass, watching the countryside blur into monotonous gray-green streaks. Concrete walls topped with gleaming razor wire sliced through the pastoral scene, growing taller, more oppressive. Stonehaven Correctional Facility. They called it other things inside. The stone jug. The pit. He'd heard whispers during processing, names spat out like curses. Palimpsest Prison. Nobody explained why. A final lurch, the hiss of air brakes, silence. A guard's barked command. Line up, single file, move. Cassian shuffled forward, eyes down, the worn fabric of his stay-tissued jumpsuit rough against his skin. The air inside the receiving area hung thick with the smell of stale sweat, disinfectant, and something else, something metallic and vaguely organic, like old blood soaked into concrete. Processing had been a blur of shouted orders, rough hands, the clang of gates. Humiliation ground down identity piece by piece. He clutched the small cardboard box containing his few approved possessions. Commissary receipts, a worn paperback with a cracked spine, a miniature pencil, and a cheap notepad acquired through an optimistic pretrial purchase. Guard Captain Bellwether stood by the final checkpoint into D Block. Her face seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as the prison walls, eyes missing nothing. She held a clipboard, her pen tapping a sharp rhythm against it. Croft Cassian. Her voice was low, gravelly, accustomed to cutting through noise. Yes, Cassian answered, his own voice thin. Cell Block D, second tier, cell 28. She made a tick on the list. Tier Sergeant will assign your bunkmate later. Rules are posted. Follow them. Break them. She paused, her gaze hardening, and this place breaks you. Understand. Understood. Another gate groaned open. D Block stretched before him, a cavern of steel and concrete noise. 4 tiers of cells stacked high, walkways crisscrossed with wire mesh. Shouts echoed, boots pounded on metal stairs, 100 conversations merged into a dull, threatening roar. The air was colder here, carrying the scent of unwashed bodies and institutional food. A burly guard with Miller stitched above his pocket jerked his head. This way, Croft, keep up. They ascended the narrow metal staircase, the steps ringing underfoot. Second tier. The walkway offered a dizzying view of the main floor below. Miller stopped abruptly before a solid steel door, identical to dozens of others. Number 28 was stenciled in faded black paint. He slammed a heavy key into the lock, the mechanism grinding loudly. Home sweet home, Miller grunted, swinging the door inward. The cell was small, brutally functional. A steel bunk bed bolted to the wall, a thin mattress on the lower rack. A combination toilet sink unit gleamed faintly under the harsh overhead light. A tiny metal desk and stool were fixed to the opposite wall. Minimal, bare, cold. Your neighbor, Miller said, gesturing with his chin towards the adjacent cell door, number 27, keeps to himself. Real quiet type. He offered a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. You won't have any trouble from that one. He slammed the door shut, the lock clicking with finality. Cassian stood alone in the sudden quiet, the ambient roar of the block now a muffled backdrop. He placed his box on the lower bunk. His bunkmate hadn't arrived yet. A small mercy. He needed a moment. He ran a hand over the rough wool blanket, then traced the crude initials scratched into the steel bed frame. Generations of inmates marking their passage through this cage. He sat on the edge of the bunk, listening. The block noise was pervasive, yet here, close to the thick walls, subtle details emerged. The drip of water somewhere down the corridor, the distant clang of a closing gate, a cough from a nearby cell, and something else, from cell 27. At first he dismissed it as part of the block's symphony, a low hum perhaps, or the vibration of pipes. But it persisted, a subtle pressure against the ear almost below the threshold of hearing. He leaned closer to the shared wall, the cold steel transferring the vibration directly into his skull. It wasn't mechanical. It felt layered, like multiple faint sounds overlapping, a sigh, a scraping noise, something akin to water moving sluggishly through a narrow space. He pressed his ear flat against the wall, the cold bit into his skin. The sounds resolved slightly. A wet, dragging sound. A low, guttural moan cut short. Then, overlaying it, a sharp, dry cough, weak and rattling. And beneath both, the faint, rhythmic creak of what might have been old bed springs. Cassian pulled away, rubbing his ear. Miller's comment echoed. Real quiet type. Was the guard mocking him? Was there someone sick next door? He spent the next hour arranging his meager possessions. The book, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, felt absurdly out of place. He opened the notepad, smoothed the first page, held the tiny pencil, documentation. It was a habit, a coping mechanism honed during the trial. Observe, record, find patterns. He drew a rough diagram of his cell, then added the adjacent cell 27. He wrote the date, the time, arrival in D block. Below cell 27, he hesitated, then wrote, audible phenomena, low hum vibrations. Possible occupant sounds, dragging, moan, cough, creaking. The overhead lights flickered, buzzed, then stabilized. Dinner call echoed up from the lower tier, a cacophony of metal trays scraping and shouted orders. Cassian remained seated, the sounds from next door momentarily drowned out. He wasn't hungry. The knot in his stomach, tied tight since sentencing, refused to loosen. Later, after the noise subsided following lock-in, the sounds returned, more distinct this time. He lay on his bunk, staring at the stained ceiling, straining to parse the layers. A woman's sob, faint and choked, the sharp crack of wood splintering, a high-pitched clinical voice murmuring indistinctly. It was impossible. Separate sounds, superimposed yet distinct. Like listening to 3 different radios tuned to stations broadcasting misery. He got up, went to the wall again. The steel felt colder than before. He pressed his ear against it, the clinical voice sharpened. Subject displays marked deterioration, tissue necrosis advancing, prognosis negative, plague era terminology. No, the tone was too modern, too detached. Asylum records perhaps. Then, abruptly, it was replaced by a desperate, rhythmic banging, metal on metal, accompanied by coarse shouts in an archaic dialect he barely recognized. Workhouse punishment. Older prison riot. Cassian stepped away, breathing shallowly. This wasn't just an odd neighbor. Miller's smirk made sense now. It was a known phenomenon. Cell 27, the empty cell. He returned to his notepad. Update, he wrote, his hand unsteady. Multiple distinct auditory events sourced from cell 27, apparent temporal layering, asylum-era medical description, older prison workhouse sounds shouting impact. He paused, pencil hovering. Hallucination, he crossed it out immediately. The vibrations were real. The cold was real. A sudden, absolute silence fell from cell 27. Not just the cessation of the layered sounds, but an active void. The background hum of the block seemed sucked into it, leaving a pressure in Cassian's ears. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, a thick, expectant pause. Then a single, soft sound drifted through the steel. A child crying. A heartbroken, desolate weeping that seemed to seep directly into his bones. Cassian gripped the edge of the metal desk, knuckles white. He looked at the solid steel door of his own cell, then at the shared wall. He was trapped here, trapped next to what? He forced himself to sit, to write. Silence followed by isolated sound, child weeping. He stared at the words, Palimpsest Prison. A manuscript page scraped clean and written over, but with traces of the original text still visible beneath. Layers upon layers of confinement, suffering, history, all compressed into one structure, and maybe, somehow, concentrated in the empty space next door. The lights on the tier clicked off, plunging the cell into near darkness, save for the weak security light filtering in from the corridor. The child's weeping faded, replaced by a faint, rhythmic scraping sound, like fingernails dragging slowly across stone. It continued, patient, persistent, as Cassian lay rigid on his bunk, listening to the impossible history bleeding through the wall. The night stretched ahead, endless and filled with the ghosts of cell 27. He closed his eyes but found no sleep. He only found the scraping sound, etching itself into his awareness. Chapter 2: Echoes in the Stone. Weeks bled into a monotonous cycle. Wake, count, chow, yard time, work detail, chow, lock-in, count, sleep. Or attempt sleep. For Cassian Croft, cell 28 had become an observation post, the shared wall with cell 27, a membrane transmitting echoes from forgotten hells. His notepad filled with cramped script, documenting the shifting soundscape next door. Some days brought the asylum. Dr. Corbin Finch's disembodied voice was a frequent visitor, calm, chillingly rational, discussing hydrotherapy, restraints, the moral failings of unseen patients. Persistent delusions require rigorous intervention. The voice would murmur, detached, followed perhaps by a muffled scream or the splash of water. Cassian learned to recognize the cadence, the slight arrogance in the spectral doctor's tone. Other days belonged to the plague hospital rumored to have occupied the site centuries ago. Wet coughs, agonized prayers in Latin or early English, the drag of bodies, the clink of surgical tools hitting ceramic bowls. A pervasive scent of vinegar and decay sometimes seeped under the cell door, making Cassian gag. Then came the workhouse, the rhythmic thud of machinery that wasn't there, the sharp commands of matron Thornycroft, idle hands breed mischief, the despairing whimpers of hungry children. Sometimes the original prison layer surfaced, clanging chains, brutal shouts, the heavy thud of a falling body. The transitions were jarring, unpredictable. Sounds bled into one another, creating grotesque symphonies of suffering. A plague victim's gasp might merge with the whir of workhouse looms, punctuated by Finch's clinical assessment. The only constant was the inconsistency and the oppressive silence that occasionally swallowed everything, a void that felt more terrifying than the noise. Cassian grew thin, gaunt. Sleep deprivation etched dark circles under his eyes. His meticulous documentation became an obsession, the only anchor in the churning sea of auditory horror. He timed the occurrences, noted their intensity, tried correlating them with external events, whether riots on other blocks, guard rotations. No pattern emerged. The prison breathed its past according to its own inscrutable rhythm. His bunkmate, a lifer named Jonesy, convicted for armed robbery, largely ignored him. Jonesy had mastered the art of prison invisibility. Keep your head down, do your time, avoid notice. He slept with plugs fashioned from toilet paper stuffed in his ears. "Place is noisy," Jonesy mumbled once, noticing Cassian awake again in the dead of night, listening intently to the wall. "Best ignore it. Walls got ears, yeah. These ones got mouths too, talkin' old talk." He rolled over, presenting his back. Cassian sought information subtly. During yard time, amidst the shouts and bouncing basketballs, he watched the other inmates. He looked for anyone whose gaze lingered on the upper tier of D block, specifically towards cell 27. He found one, an older man, rail-thin, with jerky, uncontrolled movements of his head and hands. His eyes, wide and perpetually startled, sometimes flickered towards the empty cell's location. The man picked obsessively at loose threads on his jumpsuit, muttering to himself. Cassian recognized the description. Ticker. He approached cautiously one afternoon, near the bleak concrete wall where Ticker usually stood, twitching. "Excuse me," Cassian began. Ticker jumped, eyes darting. "Wah-hoo!" His speech was fragmented, syllables tripping over each other. Don't sneak." "My name's Cassian. I'm in 28. Recognition, or perhaps just fear, flared in Ticker's eyes. He took a shuffling step away. 28, next door. Oh no." His head jerked violently. "Hear 'em, don'tcha, all talkin' at once." "Sometimes," Cassian admitted carefully. "What is it? What's in there?" Ticker laughed, a short, harsh bark that dissolved into a cough. Nothing's in there, pal. It's full up." He wrung his hands, his gaze fixed somewhere over Cassian's shoulder. "Got stuck. Riot 78. Guards threw me in just an hour, maybe." His breath hitched. "Hours too long, way too long." "What did you see?" Cassian pressed gently. Ticker flinched, covering his ears though there was no loud noise. "See? No seein', just everything, all the bad, all the hurtin', packed in tight, the coffin, sickness, the chains, the water, the needle." He shuddered, his whole body vibrating. "And the thing, the middle thing." His voice dropped to a strained whisper. "Made of pieces, all the screamin' pieces." He looked directly at Cassian then, his eyes shockingly lucid for a moment. "It remembers you too, once you listen close. It hears you listenin', adds you." He turned and shuffled away quickly, tripping over his own feet, merging back into the anonymous gray crowd. "Adds you." The phrase chilled Cassian more than the spectral voices. He tried the chaplain next. Michael Davies was younger than Cassian expected, his face earnest, his eyes holding a weariness that seemed deeper than his years. They met in the small, multi-purpose room used for counseling and religious services. "Cell 27, Chaplain Davies sighed, steepling his fingers on the worn table between them. Yes, there are. Stories, rumors. Are they just rumors, Chaplain? Cassian asked directly. Davies hesitated. The official line is structural acoustics. Old building, settling foundations, pipes carrying sound. Plausible. He didn't sound convinced. Unofficially, guards avoid assigning it. Inmates refuse it. There have been incidents over the decades. Breakdowns, self-harm. He leaned forward slightly. The prison archives are fragmented, incomplete. Fires, neglect. But records mention this wing sits atop the oldest foundations. Pre-colonial, some say. A potter's field first, then a plague quarantine zone, then the workhouse, the asylum. He shook his head. Layers of misery, Mr. Croft. Some believe this place absorbed it all. Does anyone know why that specific cell? There are theories, ley lines, a forgotten burial beneath it, a convergence point. Davies met Cassian's gaze. One persistent story involves the asylum, a doctor, Corbin Finch, rumored to have conducted unethical experiments. Some say his most extreme work occurred in what became Cell 27, a focus for his cruelty. Cassian felt a cold recognition. Dr. Finch, the calm, analytical voice dissecting suffering. Is there any way to access older records, blueprints? Highly unlikely. What exists is restricted, warden's approval only. Davies offered a sympathetic look. My advice, request a cell transfer. D-Block has openings elsewhere. Focus on your time on finding peace where you can. Peace. The word felt alien here. Cassian thanked the chaplain, the conversation leaving him more unsettled than before. Transferring felt like running, like letting the prison win. His obsession demanded answers, not retreat. That night the phenomena intensified. Dr. Finch's voice dominated, louder, clearer than ever. Subject exhibits extreme resistance to therapeutic suggestion. Cognitive pathways rigid. Observe the pupil dilation, the tremor, textbook paranoia. Cassian realized with dawning horror that Finch wasn't analyzing some long-dead patient. The commentary seemed directed at him. Increased stress elevates suggestibility, the spectral voice continued coolly. Auditory focus indicates fixation, a potential avenue for adjustment. Cassian scrambled off his bunk, heart pounding. He banged on his own cell door. Guard, guard. Footsteps echoed down the tier. Sergeant Miller appeared at the grill. What's the problem, Croft? His tone was laced with weary annoyance. The noise from next door, it's talking to me. Miller shone his flashlight into Cassian's cell, the beam catching the wildness in his eyes, the sweat on his forehead. Noise, place is full of noise. Pipe down and get some sleep. No, you don't understand, it's... Cassian trailed off. How could he explain? A dead doctor diagnosing him through a solid wall. Miller sighed heavily. Look, Croft, everyone hears things in here sometimes. Place gets in your head. Keep quiet or you'll get a visit from the psych team. They got pills for guys who hear voices. He tapped his flashlight on the bars. Last warning. His footsteps retreated. Cassian leaned his forehead against the cold steel door, defeated. He was isolated. No one would believe him. He retreated to his bunk, pulling the thin blanket tight. The voice of Dr. Finch resumed its clinical monologue, weaving itself into Cassian's thoughts, analyzing his fear, his isolation, his growing obsession. And beneath Finch's words, Cassian could sense it, a deeper presence stirring within cell 27. Something vast and composite listening. The amalgam, Ticker's thing made of pieces. It was aware of him now. It was waiting. The scraping sound started again, closer this time, seeming to come from inside his own wall. Chapter 3: Conversations Through Steel. The prison shrink, Dr. Sharma prescribed mild sedatives. Adjustment difficulties, she noted briskly, peering at Cassian over her glasses. Auditory pareidolia under stress, common in this environment. Cassian took the pills, palmed them, and flushed them down the toilet later. Chemical fog wouldn't help him understand cell 27. It would only dull his senses, make him vulnerable. He needed a different approach. If the cell was a repository of layered consciousness, perhaps it could be interacted with, not fought but queried. He began speaking to the wall softly during the quiet hours after lock-in. "Who are you?" he'd whisper, ear pressed close. "What do you want?" Usually there was no direct reply, only the ongoing tapestry of overlapping sounds. The workhouse clamor, the plague ward moans, the asylum whispers. But sometimes, triggered perhaps by his questions, specific voices sharpened. "Release." A faint, gasping voice from the plague layer would sigh. "Order must have order." Matron Thornycroft's spectral voice snapped back. "Silence the variables. Isolate the pathology," Dr. Finch analyzed coolly. One night, emboldened by desperation, Cassian tried addressing Finch directly. "Dr. Finch, can you hear me?" A pause in the usual auditory chaos. Then Finch's voice, clearer than ever, right beside his ear though the wall remained solid. Subject attempts communication. Vocalization indicates cognitive engagement with the perceived anomaly. Interesting. Cassian flinched but pressed on. "Why this cell, doctor? What happened here?" "Efficiency," Finch replied, his tone chillingly matter-of-fact. "A nexus requires focus, optimal conditions for observation, and modification. The substrate was receptive." "Substrate, you mean the place, or the people?" A dry chuckle echoed, seemingly from within the steel. "Is there a meaningful distinction? Environment shapes the organism. Suffering provides unique energetic potential." "You experimented here." "Exploration," Finch corrected, "pushing boundaries, understanding the mechanics of consciousness under duress. The failures were instructive." The voice faded slightly. "Others built upon the foundations. Cruder methods, perhaps, but the resonance compounds." Resonance, compounding suffering, the prison itself feeding on its own history. Cassian felt a wave of nausea. "What is the amalgam?" Ticker mentioned it. The temperature in the cell seemed to drop several degrees. Finch's voice lost its clinical detachment, replaced by something akin to wary respect. "A byproduct, unintended, the aggregated trauma, concentrated psychic residue given. Form, it perceives, it hungers." The voice retreated further, absorbed back into the general murmur of the cell. Cassian recorded the conversation frantically in his notepad, his pencil snapping under the pressure. He needed proof. He needed someone else to witness this. He started watching guard Captain Bellwether more closely. Her avoidance of the cell 27 corridor, her curt dismissal of any related incidents. It wasn't indifference, Cassian realized. It was contained fear. She knew. He found an opportunity during a tier shakedown. While guards tossed cells, Bellwether stood observing near the stairwell. Cassian, waiting for his turn, stepped closer. "Captain," he said, keeping his voice low. "Cell 27, it's not just noise." Bellwether's gaze sharpened, pinning him. "Inmate, focus on your own situation." "Dr. Finch," Cassian persisted quietly. "He speaks. He mentioned experiments, the amalgam." Her composure cracked for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something, fear, recognition, crossed her face before the mask slammed back down. "You're imagining things, Croft. Stress does that. Talk to the chaplain, or Sharma." "Ticker wasn't imagining things," Cassian countered. "He was put in there, he saw it." Bellwether's hand tightened on her baton. "That was a long time ago, different procedures." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Listen to me. Some doors are best left closed. Some things are best left buried. You keep poking that wall, you won't like what answers." She turned abruptly, signaling the guards toward his cell. "Search this one thoroughly." The shakedown was deliberately rough. They upended his bunk, scattered his few papers, examined his book page by page. Cassian stood silent, watching. Bellwether's reaction confirmed it. The prison administration at some level was aware. They contained the problem, isolated it, let the rumors serve as a warning. They buried it. His documentation became even more crucial. He started sketching, trying to visually represent the sounds, the layers. He drew timelines, noted emotional shifts in the phenomena. One afternoon, while sketching, he noticed a patch of discoloration on the shared wall near the floor. A darker stain, almost like old water damage, but it seemed faintly damp. He touched it hesitantly. The steel was colder here, unnaturally so. A faint, coppery smell reached him, the scent he'd sometimes noticed seeping under the door. As his fingers brushed the stain, a jolt went through him, not electric but psychic. A flood of fragmented images, a dirty hand clutching a crust of bread, a flickering gas lamp illuminating terrified eyes in an asylum ward, a body covered in weeping sores. It lasted only a second, leaving him breathless, heart hammering against his ribs. The weeping wall, he thought, remembering a phrase from Finch or perhaps the chaplain's lore. A point of direct contact. The encounter left him shaken but resolute. The cell wasn't just broadcasting, it was bleeding through. He spent hours near the stain, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening, feeling the oppressive weight of the presence on the other side. The amalgam. He could sense its attention, a vast, composite awareness focusing on him, drawn by his persistent focus. The scraping sound intensified, sometimes seeming to come from inside his own cell walls, as if something were trying to burrow through. Cracks appeared in the plaster near the floor, revealing glimpses of older material beneath dark, water-stained brick. Then something that looked disturbingly like compacted gray dust mixed with splinters of bone. Ticker intercepted him on the way back from the showers one evening, his movements more erratic than usual. "It knows you," Ticker hissed, grabbing Cassian's arm with surprising strength. His eyes were wide with terror. Listen too long, too close, it learns your shape, wants to add your little noises to the pile. What pile, Ticker? What does it do? Makes you part, Ticker whispered, his voice cracking. Takes your fear, your rememberin', stretches you thin, puts you in the wall with the others. He released Cassian abruptly and stumbled away, looking wildly over his shoulder as if pursued. Don't let it finish. Don't let it finish. The warning resonated with chilling clarity. Cassian felt a shift in the atmosphere emanating from cell 27. The random cacophony began to subside, replaced by longer, more focused periods dominated by Finch's analytical voice, or by the oppressive, hungry silence of the amalgam. It felt like a prelude, like something was gathering itself. He looked at the solid steel door of cell 27. He looked at the damp stain on his own wall. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form. He couldn't fight it from the outside. He couldn't ignore it. If he wanted to understand, if he wanted to survive, he needed to see inside. He needed to confront the heart of the Palimpsest Prison's suffering. He started watching the guards' routines, nodding shift changes, blind spots in the corridor surveillance. He began planning. Chapter 4. Within the Walls. The opportunity arrived cloaked in chaos. A fight erupted on the tier below during evening chow distribution, loud shouts, the clang of falling trays, guards rushing towards the disturbance. D-Block exploded into its usual symphony of rage and noise. In the confusion, the tier gates were briefly unsecured as officers scrambled. Cassian saw his chance. He'd spent days subtly weakening the ancient, corroded bolts holding the small ventilation grill near the floor of his cell, the one closest to the shared wall with cell 27. Using a sharpened piece of metal scavenged from the workshop, an endless, patient scraping, he'd worked in near silence during the block's loudest hours. Now, adrenaline surging, he gave the grill a final wrench. It came loose with a grating screech, lost in the din below. The opening was barely large enough to squeeze through, leading into the dark, narrow service space between the cells, a choked conduit of pipes, wiring, and decades of accumulated filth. He wriggled in, the rough concrete scraping his skin, the air thick with dust and the coppery tang emanating stronger now from cell 27's direction. He shuffled sideways in the suffocating darkness, guided by the palpable cold radiating from the adjacent cell. He reached the corresponding vent opening for cell 27. This grill was rusted shut, immovable. But below it, near the floor, the source of the cold, the source of the weeping stain, a section of brickwork felt loose. Time, neglect, and the prison's strange energies had weakened the mortar. Using his makeshift tool, he pried at the bricks. They crumbled easier than expected, releasing a puff of foul, stagnant air. He pulled out one brick, then another, creating a jagged hole just large enough to peer through. He pressed his face to the opening, heart pounding against his ribs. Cell 27. It was empty, utterly, physically empty. No bunk, no toilet, no desk. Just bare stone walls shimmering with an unnatural dampness, the floor slick with the same dark seepage that stained his own wall. The air inside was freezing, heavy, vibrating with a low, discordant hum that resonated deep in his bones. and in the center of the cell, reality buckled. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone. Ticker's description, made of pieces, was horrifyingly apt. The amalgam pulsed like a heat haze, a vaguely humanoid shape composed of swirling, indistinct fragments. Glimpses resolved for fractions of seconds. A face contorted in agony from the plague ward, a hand scrabbling desperately from the workhouse lair, the wide, terrified eyes of an asylum patient strapped to a table, a glimpse of coarse prison stripes stained dark. These images flashed, overlapped, dissolved back into the chaotic whole, accompanied by a deafening chorus of superimposed screams, whispers, coughs, and cries. The concentrated suffering of centuries given monstrous form. It wasn't solid, yet it had presence, an immense weight that pressed on Cassian's senses. It writhed slowly, drawing the faint light into itself, casting the corners of the cell into absolute shadow. It seemed to be breathing the misery embedded in the stones. Fascinating, isn't it? Dr. Finch's voice spoke, not from the amalgam but from the air beside Cassian's head, calm and conversational. Pure psychic anguish achieving critical mass, a testament to sustained environmental pressure. Cassian jerked away from the hole, scrambling backward in the narrow space, hitting the opposite wall. No escape now, subject, Finch continued pleasantly. Proximity increases receptivity. The resonance is quite strong. Cassian looked wildly back towards his own cell's vent. He had to get out. But as he moved, the amalgam in the center of cell 27 seemed to notice him through the hole. The swirling fragments coalesced slightly, turning, focusing. The multi-voiced howl intensified, slamming into Cassian's mind not just as sound, but as raw emotion, terror, pain, despair, rage. 1,000 lifetimes of suffering hitting him at once. He cried out, clutching his head, the psychic assault overwhelming. Images flooded his vision, no longer just glimpses but immersive experiences. The chilling water of hydrotherapy tubs, the gnawing pangs of starvation, the fever heat of the plague, the brutal impact of a guard's club. He felt his own identity fraying, dissolving into the vast, agonizing consciousness of the prison's past victims. Integration commencing, Finch observed clinically. The subject provides novel input, fear patterns distinct, excellent data. Panic gave Cassian a final burst of strength. He lunged for the opening back to his cell, pulling himself through the narrow gap just as something unseen seemed to lash out from the hole in cell 27's wall, brushing his leg with icy cold. He landed hard on his cell floor, gasping, scrambling to shove the vent grill roughly back into place. He leaned against the wall, trembling violently, the echoes of the amalgam's howl still ringing in his ears, the phantom pains lingering in his limbs. He had seen it. He had felt its touch. Footsteps pounded down the tier. The riot downstairs was ending. Captain Bellwether appeared outside his cell, her face grim, baton drawn. She shone her light on Cassian huddled on the floor, on the displaced vent grill, the brick dust. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She understood immediately what he had done. She didn't speak, just stared at him, her expression a mixture of anger and something else, pity, fear. "Croft," she said finally, her voice tight. "On your feet, you're being moved. Solitary." Cassian didn't resist as guards pulled him upright. His mind felt fractured, echoing with the cries of the dead. As they led him away, he looked back at cell 28, at the shared wall with the empty cell. The weeping stain seemed darker, whiter. He could almost hear, beneath the receding noise of the block, a faint, new sound added to the chorus emanating from cell 27, a sound like meticulous pencil scratching on paper. He was transferred. He never saw D Block again, but the Palimpsest Prison held him fast. He carried cell 27 within him now. Sometimes, in the sterile silence of his new isolation cell, he would hear Dr. Finch's voice offering analysis. Sometimes, he felt the phantom pangs of workhouse hunger or the burning fever of the plague. And sometimes, when sleep refused him, he felt the vast composite presence of the amalgam pressing close, examining the new fragments of fear and memory he had unwillingly contributed to its form. He became another layer, another echo trapped within the stone, another voice in the chorus of the damned. Like Ticker, he was marked, stretched thin, forever listening to the impossible history bleeding through the walls. The prison remained. The cell remained. The suffering compounded. The end.